Hello and welcome to the Week 6 supplemental lecture on José Ortega y Gasset's Revolt of the Masses. The concept of the mass becomes a preoccupation of theory that is written in the early to mid 20th century. The notion that there is this body of people who seem to be quite homogeneous, who seem to express a kind of a sameness with one another, who also seem to be feeding into new forms of mass political parties that are historically new and seem to be attacking liberal social institutions, attracts a lot of attention sociologically and theoretically. And Ortega y Gasset here is going to walk through a particular reaction to the masses, which combines sort of complicated elements of fear of loss of prestige and loss of privilege with genuine political concerns about the violent nature of the politics engaged in by mass parties. So he starts out and he says, this is an era that is characterized by the masses gaining complete social power. And then he says, and again, some of this will seem a little bit alien from the standpoint of contemporary history, but he says, as the masses by definition neither should nor can direct their own personal existence, and still less rule society in general, this fact means that actually Europe is suffering from the greatest crisis that can afflict peoples, nations, and civilization. It is called the rebellion of the masses. Okay, so you've got a group of people where something about them, from Ortega y Gasset's point of view, prevents them from meaningfully or usefully or reliably directing their own lives, and yet here they are, doing just that and asserting quite a bit of social and political authority as well. And he begins with this sort of visual representation, and again you can feel a certain loss of privilege element in this discussion. He's observing the people, common sorts, crowding into spaces that used to be reserved for various kinds of social elites. He says, it's most noticeable, the rise of the masses, in what he calls the fact of agglomeration, of plenitude. Towns are full of people, houses full of tenants, hotels full of guests, trains full of travelers, cafes full of customers, parks full of promenaders, consulting rooms of famous doctors full of patients, theaters full of spectators, and beaches full of bathers. What previously was, in general, no problem, now begins to be an everyday one, namely, to find room. Okay, it's like his favorite tourist destinations have been despoiled, but we'll get to a more serious point in a bit. He says, what is it that we see, the sight of which causes us so much surprise? We see the multitude as such, in possession of the places and the instruments created by civilization. So civilization here is the creation of a more cultured sort. It's not conceptualized as the creation of humanity as a whole, still less of these multitudes themselves. These are refined parts of society that used to be reserved for particular minority groups that are now accessible to the masses. He says, why does this cause shock? Isn't it an ideal outcome from many points of view? He says, though the fact be quite logical and natural, we cannot but recognize that this did not happen before, and now that it does. Consequently, there has been a change and innovation, and this provokes shock and surprise, and it's worth understanding what the change is about. He says, why is this happening now? The population is similar to what it was 15 years ago. He doesn't think you had this kind of massification at that point. Other people would date this a little differently. He's saying, if anything, the population might be a bit lower because of World War I. Why is agglomeration so striking now? Individuals existed before in roughly the same numbers, but he says they were scattered. They were located in various communities, disparate, spread around, and they didn't have what they perceived to be common lives. He says each individual or small group occupied a place, its own, in country, village, town, or quarter of the great city. Now suddenly they appear as an agglomeration, and looking in any direction our eyes meet with the multitudes. Not only in any direction, but precisely in the best places, the relatively refined creation of human culture previously reserved to lesser groups, in a word, to minorities. The multitude has suddenly become visible, installing itself in the preferential positions in society. Before, if it existed, it passed unnoticed, occupying the background of the social stage. Now it has advanced to the footlights and is the principal character. There are no longer protagonists. There's only the chorus. Okay, so this great bulk of humanity that was understood to know its place, to be situated in a particular location, to stay out of the limelight, to not demand pivotal social roles, now is insinuating itself in this very central position. And he goes to sociology and to a distinction between minorities and masses. And he says sociology teaches us that society is always a dynamic unity of two component factors, minorities and masses. And so what does he mean by a mass? Well, he says a mass is the assemblage of persons who are not specially qualified in some way. It is not the same thing, he says, as working masses. The mass is the average man. Now, the notion of an average is a quantitative concept, but he says that with the contemporary masses, that quantitative concept becomes a qualitative specification. He says it becomes the common social quality, man as undifferentiated from other men, but as repeating in himself a generic type. Okay, so there's this perception of the mass as though you've got sort of people as clones of one another. They're very similar. They have average attributes. There's a sense in which the statistical analysis of the average becomes adequate to specify what people are like. Whether this is accurate or not, there is a massive sociological literature worrying about the issue of masses and their conformity that occupies good portions of social theory in the 20th century. He says minorities are quite different. They have to separate themselves from the multitude, and while you might find minorities in groups, their composition as a group is subsequent, is not as important as the fact that for their own distinct personal reasons they have to make a decision to leave the multitude, to leave the mass. So the formation of them as a minority group is sort of after the fact. It happens because this particular set of people made a decision to separate from the majority, and it was a similar sort of decision. He talks about groups like the nonconformists, who, he says, may agree only in that they disagree with the majority. They may have little in common with one another, but they form a minority by dint of having pulled themselves out of the majority. And he talks about here how the masses are socially distributed. He says an individual can be determined to be a member of a mass even if they're not operating in some kind of mass formation. The qualitative characteristic of the masses for Ortega y Gasset is they're comprised of people, is all that which sets no value on itself, good or ill, based on specific grounds, but which feels itself just like everybody, and nevertheless is not concerned about it. He has a digression here where he talks about someone who really, really strives to differentiate themselves, but they're just too mediocre to do it. So they feel they're just like everybody, but they really dislike it about themselves. They really wish they could do something grand and better. That's not what he means by the masses. The masses are people who know they're just like everybody else, and they're cool with that. They're happy. In fact, quite happy to feel itself at one with everybody else. Okay? And he doesn't think this is a positive attribute. He insists that the mass-minority distinction is not identical to the lower and upper class distinction. He says it's related instead to a decision to demand more of oneself. And, oh, by the way, although it is not identical and although it's related to decisions you personally make, it nevertheless is the case that, what would you reckon, the higher classes have more members of minorities in them. So you can have people who are members of the higher class who still fit into the masses, but more of them are likely to make that personal decision to join the minorities, those people who are specialized and do great things. But you can still do it if you're a member of the lower classes. He says, it is of course plain that in these upper classes, when and as long as they really are so, there is much more likelihood of finding men who adopt the great vehicle who make this difficult decision, whereas the lower classes normally comprise individuals of minus quality. But strictly speaking, within both these classes, there are to be found mass and genuine minority. So, doesn't want to admit that this aligns to a social class distinction. There's some room for movement, but not really all that much. And so he thinks the time is characterized by the predominance of masses. He says a characteristic of our times is the predominance, even in groups that are traditionally selective, of the mass and the vulgar. And he talks about in intellectual life and in the nobility, which are two spheres that are traditionally extremely selective, extremely exclusionary. He still sees evidence of what he calls a progressive triumph of the pseudo-intellectual, unqualified, unqualifiable, and by their very mental texture, disqualified. Okay, so he thinks there's been a real watering down of what previously would have been quite select groups. And then again, he holds out the kind of olive branch that it's still quite possible for someone to be a member of the working classes and have a nobly disciplined mind, so to excel and to move themselves out of the mass, even though they're in the working classes. He says, look, in any society, special talents are required for certain functions, and they may be things like whether you have artistic talent, but these special functions also include things like politics. There are particular people who have a talent for ruling. And he says, in the past, the mass asserted no right to intervene in these specialized spheres. They realized that if they wished to intervene, they would necessarily have to acquire those special qualities and cease being mere mass. They recognized their place in a healthy, dynamic social system. Now the mass asserts itself, however, and insinuates itself into places that were previously reserved for the minority. He says the mass has decided to advance to the foreground of social life, to occupy the places, to use the instruments, and to enjoy the pleasures hitherto reserved for the few. The places were never intended for the multitude, for their dimensions are too limited, and the crowd is continuously overflowing. The mass, without ceasing to be mass, is supplanting the minorities. Okay, so far he's drawing a lot of images from leisure spaces. You have this picture of sort of going to the museum of a Sunday and it's overflowing with, tourists who've taken cheap plane flights to get there or whatever else. These images of people intruding themselves into refined areas when he regards them as too crude. There's going to be a more serious point here, though, and that point has to do with the rise of mass political parties that are going after minorities, and not only wealthy minorities, in a savage way. So he talks about the political domination of masses. He says, look, leisure enjoyments are not the problem. If people now have the means due to increasing social wealth to indulge in this is not really the problem. The problem is that the mass presence reflects a general feature of our time, and specifically the problem for him is the impact that it's having on the political sphere. He says, I believe that the political innovations of recent times signify nothing less than the political domination of the masses. The old democracy was tempered by a generous dose of liberalism and of enthusiasm for law. By serving these principles, the individual bound himself to maintain a severe discipline over himself. Under the shelter of liberal principles and the rule of law, minorities could live and act. And this is right, and it's right in minorities of a broad way. So this is something that gets criticized. We've looked at critics of liberal political theory who have complained about the fact that the minorities protected were often quite privileged interests. But it also protects unprivileged minorities. It cuts both ways. Foucault's critique of the way in which particular kinds of liberal conceptions of self-governance impose a discipline here is spun more positively. It is a discipline over self that, among other things, creates a space of safety for particular minority groups. He says, today we're witnessing the triumphs of a hyper-democracy in which the mass acts directly outside the law, imposing its aspirations and its desires by means of material pressure. And then he goes to a particular interpretation in competing forms of theory. He says, it is a false interpretation of the new situation to say that the mass has grown tired of politics and handed over the exercise of it to specialized persons. Okay, so this is one of these theories that things have become very bureaucratized, that you have an administrative state that has specialized experts that do things and that the general population has left them to do it. He says, quite the contrary. That was what happened previously. That was democracy. The mass took it for granted that, after all, in spite of their defects and weaknesses, the minorities understood a little more of public problems than it did itself. Now, on the other hand, the mass believes that it has the right to impose and give force of law to notions born in the café, I doubt whether there have been other periods of history in which the multitude has come to govern more directly than in our own. That is why I speak of hyper-democracy. Okay? Now, it's still hard to tell what we're talking about here, what our reference is, and how much of this is a complaint about the loss of privilege and about things like the expansion of the franchise, and how much it is a complaint about something that is more serious. He moves from politics to intellectual domination, and some of the things he's saying here will echo some of the things that we read last week in the sort of pushback in the science wars. He says, the present-day writer, when he takes his pen to hand to treat a subject which he has studied deeply, has to bear in mind that the average reader, who has never concerned himself with this subject, if he reads, does so with the view not of learning something from the writer, but rather of pronouncing judgment on him when he is not in agreement with the commonplaces the said reader carries in his head. The characteristic of the hour is that the commonplace mind, knowing itself to be commonplace, has the assurance to proclaim the rights of the commonplace and to impose them wherever it will. Then he shifts register, and it becomes less petty, less concerned with loss of privilege, and more in the frame of worrying about the rise of new kinds of mass parties. He says, the mass crushes beneath it everything that is different, everything that is excellent, individual, qualified, and select. Anybody who is not like everybody, who does not think like everybody, runs the risk of being eliminated. Here we have the formidable fact of our times, described without any concealment of the brutality of its features. Okay? And these strands run through a body of 20th century political theory and social theory, worried about the rise of mass parties, worried about the genuine murderous character of these parties, about the way in which they abolish forms of liberalism that are designed to protect minorities, and they become dominant in large parts of the world across the 20th century. And yet, at the same time, there is a conflicted element in these sorts of critiques, because it also does focus on the loss of particular kinds of privilege that may in fact be things that one could legitimately criticize, and these mixtures can make it difficult to sort of tease apart the elements in the critique.